On August 20th, 2008, a Spanish passenger plane suddenly crashes during takeoff, resulting in the death of 154 passengers and flight crew. When the investigation was conducted to determine the cause of the crash, it was found that the crash occurred due to a minor negligence that could have been avoided. Actually, we are talking about the tragic crash of Spanair Flight 5022. It is known as the worst aviation crash in Spain's history to date. So, how did this crash happen? Whose fault was it? And how could this incident have been avoided? Let's find out in today's video. But before we start the video, we request you to subscribe to our channel. Creating content like this takes a lot of time and effort, and your subscription would be very encouraging for us. So, let's start the video now. The day of August 20th, 2008. In the afternoon, 166 passengers and 6 crew members board Spanair Flight 5022 at Madrid Airport in Spain. Their destination was Gran Canaria Airport, located in the Canary Islands. Most of the passengers on the flight were Spanish, but besides them, there were also some Germans, French, Turkish, and Italians who were on their way to the Canary Islands for a summer vacation. On this day, the flight was operated by 39-year-old Captain Antonio Garcia Luna, who had 8,000 hours of flight experience. Before this, he had worked as a flight instructor and test captain in the Spanish Air Force. In 1999, he joined Spainair as a first officer, and by 2006, he became the captain of the MD-80 aircraft. Prior to becoming a captain, Captain Antonio had been categorized as an above-average pilot in the training and testing provided. However, he was also advised to improve his crew resource management skills. In addition to the captain, 31-year-old Francisco Javier Mulet was present on this flight as a first officer. He had joined Spainair just a year ago, and up to that point, he had only accumulated 220 hours of flying experience. Now, talking about the aircraft, a 15-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-82 was used for this flight. Despite its age, this aircraft was considered the safest passenger plane in Europe and the USA during the 1990s and 2000s. So, the passengers were seated in the plane, and the pilot was ready to take off. At that moment, the tower controller granted permission for takeoff from runway 36 left. But as soon as the pilot tries to take off, they feel a problem in the plane. So, without wasting any time, they steer the plane to the side and immediately contact the Palma Maintenance Control Center. Actually, inside the aircraft, the RAM air temperature probe was showing an abnormally high reading. For your information, the role of this probe is to measure the air temperature on the surface of the aircraft. And there are 2 reasons for measuring this temperature. The pilot decides whether to turn on or off the anti-icing heat in the flight. Secondly, it is necessary to measure this temperature to involve the autopilot, especially the auto throttles. Because if the RAM air temperature sensor senses a high temperature, it means the plane is flying fast. In such a situation, if the engine power is not reduced, the engine could be damaged. In other words, a high RAM air temperature means low engine throttle, which is not ideal for takeoff. In the condition of high RAM air temperature, the pilot did not want to take any risks, and they were not sure whether they should take off with this fault or not. Therefore, they decide to have the plane's systems checked to ensure their certainty. In response, the Maintenance Control Center instructs to reset the Z29 circuit breaker, which supplies electrical power to the R8E, the RAM air temperature heating element. The crew follows the same instruction, but the probe's temperature does not decrease. After this, the pilot takes the plane to the maintenance engineers. The engineers instruct the crew to use dry ice cooling to reduce the temperature and to pull the circuit breaker so that the electrical supply for the RAM probe heater can be disconnected. During all these checkups, the plane had experienced significant delays from its schedule. This caused a lot of inconvenience for the passengers, who were continuously urging the crew members and the pilot to take off. Actually, on that day, the airport was bathed in sunlight, and due to the engine shutdown, the plane's cooling system was not working. As a result, the temperature inside the plane had risen significantly. The heat was making the passengers quite restless. At the same time, they were getting impatient due to the delay, so they started putting pressure on the pilot and crew members to take off as quickly as possible. People were repeatedly asking for the plane to take off and expressing their frustration. When, despite trying for an hour, the problem couldn't be understood, the engineer decides to simply cut off the electrical supply to the rat probe. In response to the pressure from the passengers, the pilot gets ready for takeoff. After that, the crew prepares for departure, and the plane is refueled. During this time, the pilot steps out of the plane to check if the refueling process is being done quickly or not. This indicates how much pressure there was on him to get the plane to take off quickly. During this time, since the plane was on the maintenance gate instead of the runway, the pilot instructs the first officer to once again request flying clearance from ATC. In a hurry, the first officer mistakenly calls the wrong controller, clearly indicating that the atmosphere inside the cockpit was quite stressful at that time. Perhaps this was also happening because, throughout the entire incident, a Spanair flight attendant who was sitting with the pilot was continuously discussing the fault with the first officer. And because of her, the first officer was also unable to focus on his duties. Perhaps it could be due to a lack of experience in handling such situations. Anyway, in a hurry, the captain quickly obtains clearance from ATC and gets ready for the start checklist. The pilot starts the engine, and the first officer begins to read the before start checklist. In fact, it is crucial to read this checklist before takeoff on any flight. It allows for a cross-check to ensure that all tasks that should be completed in the plane before takeoff have been done. There were a total of 8 items in this checklist. But when the first officer is about to read the last item, flaps and slats, the captain interrupts, telling them to obtain permission for taxiing from ATC. As a result, the first officer couldn't read the last item, flaps and slats, in the before start checklist. This was a significant oversight because setting the flaps is crucial for the pilot before takeoff. If the flaps are not set, the plane cannot take off. Now, as the pilot starts preparing the plane for taxiing towards the runway, they go through the taxi checklist. This means the pilot has checked the indicator light of the automatic reserve thrust system. In essence, during the taxi checklist, this light should be on, indicating that if an engine fails during takeoff, additional automatic thrust is available. However, if the slats are not configured for takeoff, this light will not be on. At this time, the light was off, but the pilot did not pay attention to it. This was another opportunity for the pilot to prevent the crash. Additionally, at this point, the pilot was supposed to check the takeoff briefing, but this item was also not checked in the cockpit voice recorder recording. Anyway, after the taxi checklist, the plane starts quickly advancing on the runway. During this time, the first officer, who was checking the center of gravity and the position of the flap wheel, along with reviewing the flaps and slats indicator on the LCD screen, says, "Flaps 11. This meant that the flaps should have been set at 11, but on the LCD screen, it was showing 0. Normally, after the first officer's command, the captain should have monitored these essential checks. But perhaps, at this time, their entire focus was only on getting the runway and the plane to fly quickly, so they couldn't pay attention to the first officer's statement. At this point, there was nothing that could prevent the crash, except for the last line, known as the toes. Finally, the pilot takes off. And a system alarm goes on, which indicated that the aircraft was not yet ready for takeoff, but the alarm wasn't loud enough for the pilots to hear. The plane takes off and, reaching a speed of 157 knots, begins to fly. At this moment, suddenly the stall warning and stick shaker activate, and the aircraft banks 32 degrees to the right. At this time, the aircraft was flying 40 feet above the runway, and due to the aircraft being out of control, both pilots panic. The first officer believes it's an engine failure and reduces engine thrust. However, the root cause was the failure to deploy flaps and slats. Pulling the throttle forward immediately after reducing engine thrust was not the correct procedure, as it worsened the situation. The incorrect procedure of pulling the throttle forward led to the aircraft rapidly descending, and the tail of the plane collided with the ground first. After sliding on the ground for a short distance, the front part of the plane separates from the rest of the aircraft. The plane gradually separates into different sections, and fuel leakage starts to occur. Due to the fuel leak, the plane catches fire, and as it continues to slide, it eventually falls into the De La Vega River. The whole incident took only 10 seconds. And out of 172 people, 154 die on the spot. After this accident, an investigation is immediately initiated by Spain's Civil Aviation Accident and Incident Investigation Commission, known as SAIAC. SAIAC releases its initial report on October 6, 2008, as a part of the investigation. According to the data in the initial report released by SAIAC, the pilot was attempting to take off the aircraft with 0 degrees flaps setting. As they did not receive any warning alarms, this led to the plane crash. After this report, on August 17, 2009, SAIAC releases another report. In this report, the crash conclusion of the first report is confirmed. Additionally, the pilot is also held responsible for the crash in this report. Because, according to the recording found in the cockpit, the captain interrupted the first officer while reading the "Set and check the flaps, slat lever and lights" item, which was part of the after-start checklist. Perhaps if the first officer had read this last item of the checklist, the crash could have been prevented. Additionally, as we saw in the story, when a solution to the fault in the plane could not be found, the crew members and the pilot were under continuous pressure to take off due to the delay in the passenger flight. Due to this pressure, the pilot had to forcefully and hastily take off the plane. In my opinion, this was the main reason for the plane crash. Actually, friends, it's human nature that when we work under too much pressure, we often struggle to analyze things properly. And in such situations, our entire focus is directed towards the task for which pressure has been imposed upon us. This is exactly what we observe in this crash story. The captain instructs the first officer to obtain permission for taxiing from ATC without listening to the checklist item. Additionally, when the plane was on the runway and about to take off, the first officer had also mentioned setting the flaps to 11. However, the pilot ignored this as well because their full attention was outside the plane on the runway. Well, these discussions always happen after an incident occurs, that if certain actions were taken, things would have turned out that way, and if not taken, we could have avoided accidents, and so on. For now, we can only pray for those who lost their lives in this incident and their families. You can also show your sympathy towards these people by liking the video. Also, please comment and let us know what you think was the biggest reason for this incident to happen. See you soon with another amazing story. Until then, goodbye, take care.